opportunity, go ahead and talk about how the decision was formed and why you reached it.
As we were looking at the first 3 days of last week and bringing our students back for in-person learning, we have continuously monitored the data in terms of the number of positive COVID cases, but then also more problematic are the number of quarantines that are associated with the positive cases. We've tried really from the very beginning back in March of 2020 to not only continue collaboration with our local health officials, our local leaders, but then also our state health officials and then certainly the current conditions that we experience not only in our greater community but in our classrooms. This is much different than what we were experiencing last year for probably a variety of reasons. I think in terms of what we're experiencing on our end that looks different is really how it's impacting our school-age students and the speed in which students and our staff are not only contracting the virus, but also, as I mentioned earlier, how that impacts the number of quarantines. As of yesterday afternoon, we had surpassed more than 700 quarantines of students across the district in our 24 schools. As a school official, as a parent, I find it critical that we do everything that we can in terms of implementing safety measures to ensure that we are able to continue with 5 days per week of in-person instruction. We learned last year how problematic it was when we were required to move to virtual instruction. We want to try to avoid that if at all possible, and part of that is to implement this latest safety measure of requiring face coverings for all of our students and our staff, regardless of whether or not they have been vaccinated.
Is the Delta variant of concern specifically?
We have really tried to keep our focus on the educational aspect, knowing that, again, our top priority is always and will continue to be ensuring the safety of our students and staff. But in terms of trying to distinguish the significance from the original COVID-19 virus and the variants that are out there, we've really just tried to leave that to our health officials. Again, our priority is ensuring that we can maintain 5 days of in-person learning for our students. We know that's best not only for our students and our staff, but it enables our community to continue to move forward. I do want to go back to the very first conversation we had as a community back in March of 2020, and I wanted our greater community to know at that very point in time that we as a school organization, Warren County Public Schools, were committed to doing whatever we could for the greater benefit of the entire community. Typically, we focus mostly on our school community, but it was really apparent early on to me that this was much bigger than our particular school district. This was a community challenge, and again, we've tried to continuously engage in productive dialogue with all of our community leaders, primarily our local health officials, as we try to, as best we can, navigate a very challenging and difficult situation for all of us.
Are you offering online at all, like options for people if they don't want to come to school?
We do offer Beacon Academy for students grades 7 through 12. We opened that virtual academy back in 2015, and we did see a small influx of new enrollees when we began this pandemic back again more than a year ago. In terms of our K-6, we do not have a virtual programming option for those particular students. There were some additional requirements if a school district attempted to offer the K-4. But from our standpoint, we know that the virtual instruction is productive and can be successful for a small percentage of our students, but the vast majority, they need to be in person. And when we start talking about our most youngest students, I think it's very clear from our experience that the virtual is even more challenging in terms of ensuring their learning in regards to that. So at this point, we do not have a virtual option for our K-6 students.
some of the parents that I spoke to this morning who are protesting are saying that, only the N95 works, which is why they don't understand why the school is implementing this mask requirement for, a cloth or a surgical mask. Maybe speak a little bit on that and how you would respond to those parents.
Well, we've long recognized the debate on the quality of masks in our schools in terms of not only their makeup, as you mentioned, the N95, but then also how they're fitted and how they're worn. And I think most would agree that if they're not properly fitted and they're not worn accordingly, that the potential for an additional safety layer there is compromised to some level. Obviously, we don't know the degree of effectiveness in this mask as opposed to that mask. Here's what we do know, and here's what we've tried to do, again, from the very beginning, is really just stick to what we know to be true and factual, and let the debates kind of occur on their own in terms of political beliefs, philosophical beliefs, and so forth. So with that, here's what we do know. If we have our students and our staff wearing masks properly, we can reduce the number of quarantines. We know that because the CDC guidance is very clear that if all entities are wearing a face covering properly, then the quarantining distance, if you will, is 3 feet or more, meaning that if an individual is 3 feet or further from the potential known case, then they would not have to quarantine, provided that they were wearing a face covering and it was being worn properly. When we leave it optional, which is what we did to begin the school year, and I think we probably had in the neighborhood of 10% or less compliance in terms of following the recommendation, and of course it was a recommendation, then that compromised the number, if you will, of individuals being quarantined due to potential exposure. And with us just opening school now in day 5, we know that all of these cases came outside of the normal school day. And we can only expect that we'll see an increase as the community is experiencing over time. And it's our hope that by wearing these face coverings that we will greatly minimize the number of students being quarantined, which again would diminish the number of students that are experiencing interrupted learning. We've also put a time frame of Labor Day. We felt like that it was very important to keep our community abreast of the time frame that we're looking at. Certainly if we see a drastic improvement, we could lift that sooner. Obviously, there's nobody on the board, there's nobody in our school district that wants to have the requirement of wearing a face covering. It's merely our really last effort, if you will, to keep our kids in school, and we're optimistic that it will help, but we also must acknowledge the fact that with the spread that we're seeing, that we could be forced in the near future to move all virtual. We'll try to avoid that, but at the end of the day, you have to have the available staff necessary to ensure our priorities of safety, learning, and opportunities.
Can you give a breakdown of like student quarantines versus staff quarantines?
That number is very fluid. As I mentioned, we're well over 700 quarantines, but that data is coming in from yesterday. Because of the large number of cases that we're dealing with, because of the individual attention that we must provide to each of these particular situations, we don't have the latest number. What I will tell you is the vast majority of them do involve our students.
And could that have been prevented if the school started with masks last week?
What we do know that if we had started school with the face coverings, we could have reduced the number of quarantines. Obviously, there's no way for us to verify specifically what that number would be, but if you kind of put pen to paper and you think about a 3-foot radius as compared to a 6-foot radius, and then envision what the typical classroom looks like in our school district, you can imagine that it's safe to assume that that number could be cut in half. But again, we don't have definitive data to suggest the specifics.
I was gonna ask you, what are your thoughts about the protests this morning? And obviously things got a little bit aggressive within people arguing with each other, arguing with the media, arguing with whomever happened to walk by. What were your thoughts about the protest and kind of its change from supposedly being peaceful to kind of being a little aggressive?
Yeah, actually, I was not aware of anything other than peaceful demonstration till just really a few minutes ago, so it's really premature for me to speculate or to comment on that particular aspect. Now, what I will tell you is that earlier this morning, we did have a large number of individuals come into our front office reception area requesting to speak with me, and we did go out there and I think probably for a little more than an hour, spoke to them, tried to, again, provide some clarity to the entire process from March 2020 to where we're at here today in August. That being said, we also wanted to point them to the communication that was provided yesterday. We've tried very diligently from the very beginning not only to be transparent with the available information that we have, but then also be very timely in communicating any changes and our next steps. And of course, with something like this, it's very fluid. That really is a daily challenge. But again, we had very productive dialogue. I think the vast majority of those individuals, once they realized, again, what we shared in our communication yesterday, that this is primarily a focus of ensuring that our students are in school 5 days per week in person. And the quarantine guidance will help us if, and only if, we have all of our individuals masked up.